the fruit that spoke when no one else would, deconstructing the pineapple paradox. Disclaimer: the following analysis represents careful examination of publicly documented evidence, expert testimony, and investigative records. We are not making definitive claims about guilt or innocence, but rather exploring how physical evidence creates patterns that invite deeper scrutiny. Multiple interpretations remain possible. This examination focuses on documented contradictions and the questions they raise about human behavior under unimaginable pressure. The mystery surrounding JonBenét Ramsey continues to be defined less by clear answers and more by a persistent constellation of bewildering inconsistencies, gaps that force us to constantly revisit the first crucial hours when the investigation's path was irrevocably set. We've spent years walking through these same rooms, reading these same statements, examining these same photographs. But recently, something shifted. Not because new evidence emerged, but because we finally stopped accepting explanations that require us to ignore what sits plainly before us. At the heart of one of the most perplexing contradictions lies something almost absurdly ordinary. A bowl of pineapple, not a weapon, not a ransom note, just fruit in a bowl on a kitchen table. Yet this simple domestic object has become the quiet witness that refuses to cooperate with any narrative we've been offered. Its presence whispers truths that the loudest voices in this case have spent nearly 3 decades trying to drown out. We've circled this timeline for months, but one moment keeps resurfacing, not because it's extraordinary, but because once you truly see it, it reshapes everything you thought you knew about that final night. The timeline impossibility, denial, and the pineapple paradox. Theme 1. The certainty that cannot hold. There's something almost hypnotic about the way John and Patsy Ramsey describe arriving home on Christmas night. We've read their statements so many times we could recite them from memory. JonBenét was sound asleep in the car. John struggled slightly to lift her. She was growing, getting heavier, but still his little girl. He carried her upstairs, her body completely limp with the profound unconsciousness of an exhausted child. Patsy helped change her into night clothes. The child never stirred, never woke, never opened her eyes. "That's it for the night," John said in his 1998 interview with Lou Smith. When JonBenét went to sleep, she stayed asleep. This wasn't speculation or uncertainty. It was stated as absolute fact, the kind of parental knowledge that comes from years of knowing your child's patterns, their rhythms, their reliable habits. Patsy confirmed it with her own language. Really zonked. Not just tired, not merely asleep, but profoundly, deeply, unreachably unconscious. The child who had been so full of energy at the Christmas party, so excited about her presence, so alive with the particular electricity of a 6-year-old on Christmas Day, had finally surrendered to exhaustion. She would not wake until morning. And then came the autopsy report. Partially digested fruit or vegetable matter consistent with pineapple found in JonBenét's small intestine. Not in her stomach, where recently consumed food would remain, but in her intestine, where it would have traveled during the digestive process. The medical examiners, working with established science about gastric emptying and intestinal transit, calculated backward from the digestion state. The pineapple had been consumed within approximately 2 to 4 hours before the child's death. We pause here because we must. This isn't interpretable evidence subject to competing expert opinions. This is biology, as concrete and unarguable as bone structure or blood type. The child ate pineapple during the hours after the family returned home, during the window when both parents insist she remained deeply, uninterruptedly asleep. One of these certainties must be false. From a psychological perspective, we find ourselves examining not just the contradiction, but the nature of the denial surrounding it. When confronted with the autopsy findings, the Ramseys didn't express confusion or wonder. They didn't say, "That's strange, maybe she woke up and we didn't hear her." They didn't offer the tentative uncertainty we'd expect from parents whose recollection was being contradicted by physical evidence. Instead, they denied, firmly, absolutely, repeatedly. Neither parent fed her. She didn't wake, she didn't eat. The pineapple couldn't have been consumed in their home during those hours because those hours were accounted for, locked down, sealed in the certainty of parental knowledge. But the child's digestive system tells a different story, and digestive systems don't lie to protect anyone's narrative. The physiological reality forces us to confront how digestion actually works. Food doesn't teleport into intestines. It follows a predictable path, mouth to esophagus to stomach to small intestine. The rate of this journey varies based on the food's composition, the individual's metabolism, and other factors, but within known parameters. Pineapple, being largely water and fiber, processes relatively quickly. For it to be found in JonBenét's small intestine at the time of autopsy, consumption had to occur during the crucial window after arriving home. Someone fed this child, or she fed herself. During hours, her parents state with absolute certainty she was unconscious and unfed. From a forensic criminology standpoint, this contradiction becomes the crack in the foundation. Everything the family's timeline rests upon. The idea that the children were put to bed and the household retired for the evening. That whatever occurred happened during hours of parental sleep and helplessness. That the perpetrator must have been an intruder operating during these unsupervised hours. All of it requires accepting that JonBenét remained asleep after arriving home. But she didn't. The pineapple proves it. And if she was awake, if she was active, if she was eating, then someone knows what else occurred during those hours. Someone has information they haven't shared. Someone's account of the evening is incomplete at best, false at worst. The philosophical question that emerges asks us to consider the psychology of certainty in the face of contradiction. Why maintain an obviously false claim when the evidence proving its falsehood is literally written in the child's digestive tract? What purpose does this denial serve? In his 1998 interview, Ramsey offered something revealing. He acknowledged that if they had simply admitted to feeding JonBenét pineapple before bed, it would have ended the discussion with police. The pineapple would no longer be a mystery requiring investigation. Yet they didn't make this easy choice. They maintained the denial despite understanding that the denial itself created suspicion, elevated them from grieving victims to defensive subjects under scrutiny. This suggests the denial serves a purpose more important than avoiding suspicion. It protects something. But what? Perhaps the answer lies not in the pineapple itself, but in what acknowledging it would require acknowledging next. If JonBenét was awake and eating during hours claimed as sleep time, what else was happening? Who else was awake? What other activities occurred that aren't part of the official timeline? The denial we begin to suspect isn't about the pineapple at all. It's about the door that acknowledging the pineapple would open. A door into hours that must remain closed, a space in the timeline that cannot be examined, a sequence of events that cannot be admitted without unraveling everything built to explain what came after. Theme 2: The fragments of memory and the necessities of forgetting. We've been trained by years of crime dramas to look for the big lie, the dramatic deception, the elaborate false alibi, the calculated misdirection. But sometimes truth hides not in grand fabrications, but in small silences, in the gaps between what's remembered and what's forgotten, in the selective precision of recollection that recalls some details with crystal clarity while claiming complete blankness about others. Patsy Ramsey could remember many things about Christmas Day with remarkable specificity. The presents, the joy on JonBenét's face, the party at the White's house, the drive home, the child's profound exhaustion. These memories were vivid, detailed, offered with the confidence of someone whose recollection is clear and reliable. But the pineapple. No memory at all. Not "I'm not sure," not "I might have, but I can't recall," but rather a complete absence. She didn't prepare it, she didn't serve it, she didn't see it. The bowl, the spoon, the arrangement on the table, all of it appeared to her as evidence of someone else's actions, foreign to her household patterns, inexplicable within the framework of that evening. Yet her fingerprints tell us her hands touched that bowl. Not might have touched, not possibly touched, but definitely, provably touched. The ridge patterns of her fingers, unique in all the world, were pressed into the bowl's surface with enough contact to leave identifiable prints. From a psychological standpoint, this creates a fascinating puzzle. Memory researchers have documented how trauma can fragment recollection, how extreme stress can create what appears to be selective amnesia. The mind, protecting itself from unbearable knowledge, can edit out events, create gaps, refuse to grant conscious access to memories too painful to integrate. But traumatic amnesia typically affects emotionally loaded content. The moment of horror itself, the discovery of terrible truth, the actions taken during acute crisis. It doesn't usually erase mundane domestic activities like touching a serving bowl. Unless, of course, that mundane activity connects directly to what followed, making it impossible to remember the innocent moment without remembering what came after. Research published in Psychological Science examines how memory editing works under extreme stress. Loftus and Davis, 2006. The mind doesn't simply delete events wholesale. Instead, it creates what researchers call protective gaps. Spaces where memory should exist but doesn't, typically surrounding events the conscious self cannot afford to know. The person genuinely believes they don't remember because the psyche has locked those memories away, not through intentional deception but through automatic psychological self-preservation. Could this explain Patsy's certainty that she didn't prepare the pineapple despite evidence she touched the bowl? Perhaps. The mind that touched that bowl might have been operating in a state the conscious Patsy cannot access. A liminal space between sleep and waking, between normal awareness and crisis response. A moment she genuinely cannot recall because recalling it would require confronting what it led to. Or perhaps the explanation is simpler and more troubling. Perhaps the denial serves not to protect Patsy's own psyche but to protect someone else. Perhaps she knows exactly when and how her fingerprints got on that bowl. But that knowledge cannot be shared without exposing truths that would destroy what remained of her shattered family. The physiological dimension asks us to consider what state allows for actions without memory formation. Sleepwalking is one possibility, though sleepwalkers typically perform habitual actions rather than novel tasks like preparing snacks. Extreme dissociation is another, where the person functions in a kind of autopilot state, actions occurring without full conscious awareness or later recollection. But both explanations require us to accept that Patsy's hands performed actions, removing pineapple from refrigerator, finding bowl, locating spoon, arranging items on table, without her conscious mind being fully present or without that consciousness creating accessible memories. It's possible. The human mind is capable of remarkable compartmentalization, but it strains against our understanding of how memory and action typically connect. From an anthropological perspective, we can examine how the kitchen functions in American middle-class households as a space of maternal authority and knowledge. Mothers typically know their kitchens intimately, where things are kept, which utensils are used for which purposes, the patterns and habits of food preparation. Patsy's observation that the pineapple arrangement was wrong, the spoon too large, the presentation not how she would do it, reveals this intimate knowledge of her domestic space. Yet this same woman who knows her kitchen so well cannot explain how her fingerprints arrived on the bowl sitting in her kitchen on her table. The gap between knowledge of the space and claimed ignorance of the action creates a cognitive dissonance that demands resolution. The forensic criminology perspective notes that fingerprints require actual touch, actual contact, actual handling. These aren't trace amounts of DNA that might transfer through secondary contact. These are prints left by hands gripping, moving, holding an object. Patsy's hands were on that bowl. The physics of fingerprint deposition is straightforward and unambiguous, so we return to the central question. How does a woman touch a bowl and have no memory or acknowledgement of doing so? The answers narrow uncomfortably. Either her memory is genuinely disrupted through trauma, dissociation, or protective editing, or her memory is intact, but the truth it contains cannot be spoken without unraveling carefully constructed narratives about that night. Theme 3. The sun in the shadows. There's another set of fingerprints on that bowl. Smaller prints. A child's prints. Burke Ramsey's prints, to be specific. And when we consider Burke's presence in this pineapple moment, the timeline begins to fracture in entirely new ways. Burke was 9 years old enough to navigate a kitchen independently, old enough to prepare simple foods, old enough to want a snack during wakeful hours. His fingerprints on the bowl prove he touched it. Yet both parents claimed Burke was asleep in his bed, undisturbed by the chaos of the morning, unhearing of his mother's screams that brought his father running. The Denver Post reported inconsistencies in statements about Burke's whereabouts and wakefulness that night. Simpson, 2016. Initially, both parents insisted he slept through everything. The discovery of the note, the frantic 911 call, the arrival of police and friends, the hours of waiting, even the discovery of his sister's body. A 9-year-old sleeping so profoundly that the household erupting in crisis didn't rouse him struck investigators as implausible. Later it emerged that Burke had told investigators he was awake after being put to bed. This contradicted his parents' timeline, creating another gap between stated facts and actual events. If Burke was awake, if he came downstairs, if he was moving through the house during hours his parents believed him asleep, what else might have occurred outside their awareness or acknowledgement? The pineapple scene begins to suggest a different possibility. Not parents feeding a child, but children feeding themselves. Burke up late, perhaps unable to sleep after the excitement of Christmas. JonBenét waking or never having fully slept, joining her brother in the kitchen. A late-night snack shared by siblings during hours their parents believed them safely asleep upstairs. This scenario requires no elaborate staging, no complex deception. Just two children awake when they were supposed to be asleep, sharing pineapple in the kitchen, leaving the evidence where it fell. Ordinary childhood behavior during extraordinary hours. But if we accept this possibility, that both children were awake and active during the crucial window, we must confront what it means for everything that followed. If Burke was downstairs with JonBenét during the hours before her death, he knows what happened. He knows what occurred after the pineapple was consumed. He is potentially the last person to have seen his sister alive. From a psychological perspective informed by research on childhood trauma, we must consider what carrying such knowledge would do to a 9-year-old. If Burke witnessed something terrible, or participated in something that spiraled beyond his control or understanding, the psychological mechanisms protecting him from that knowledge would be formidable. Dr. Judith Herman's work on trauma and recovery describes how children create elaborate mental architectures to contain unbearable knowledge. Herman, 1997. The memory doesn't disappear but becomes walled off, accessible only in fragments, often experienced as something that happened to someone else or didn't happen at all. The child might genuinely believe he doesn't know, precisely because knowing would shatter the self-concept he needs to maintain functioning. Research in child development on sibling conflicts and accidental harm notes specific patterns when children cause unintended injury to siblings, Cicchetti and Toth, 2005. The child typically displays profound shock and denial, sometimes creating alternative narratives where the injury happened differently or wasn't their fault. This isn't calculated lying, but the psyche's desperate attempt to reconcile action with consequence, to maintain the self-concept of good child while confronting evidence of terrible harm. The physiological dimension reminds us that 9-year-olds' prefrontal cortices, the brain region responsible for impulse control, consequence prediction, and behavioral regulation, are still profoundly underdeveloped. A child this age can act impulsively during moments of frustration or dysregulation, with harmful consequences far exceeding their intent or understanding. The gap between action and comprehension can be vast. If something occurred during that pineapple moment or shortly after, a conflict that escalated, a physical interaction that went wrong, an impulsive action with irreversible consequences, a 9-year-old would be neurologically incapable of the kind of rational response we'd expect from an adult. Panic, not logic, would drive subsequent behavior. From an anthropological perspective, we can examine how American culture in the 1990s viewed childhood innocence, particularly in affluent families like the Ramseys. The idea that a child could be involved in a sibling's death was nearly unthinkable, a violation of cultural scripts about protected childhood and family safety. This cultural resistance might have shaped both investigators reluctant to seriously consider a child's involvement, and family response, parents unable to contemplate or acknowledge such a possibility. The forensic criminology literature on juvenile offenders notes that when children cause fatal harm to siblings, families often engage in what researchers call protective reconstruction, creating narratives that shield the child from responsibility, consequences, and even their own knowledge of what occurred. Underwood and Patch, 1999. This isn't calculated criminal conspiracy, but desperate parental protection. The instinct to save the surviving child overwhelming all other considerations. We find ourselves contemplating an uncomfortable possibility. That the pineapple moment was the last normal thing that happened that night. That what followed spiraled from sibling interaction gone catastrophically wrong. That the elaborate staging and insistent denial served not to hide adult crime but to protect a child from the unbearable knowledge of his own role in his sister's death. This doesn't assert fact. It asks questions that the evidence itself raises. Why do both Burke's and Patsy's fingerprints appear on the bowl? Why the emphatic denial that anyone fed JonBenét when her digestive system proves someone did? Why the insistence that Burke was asleep when his own statements suggest he was awake? Why the gap between what the physical evidence shows and what the stated timeline claims? 2. The scene of ingestion. Anomalies in the kitchen. Theme 1. The arrangement that doesn't make sense. We've looked at this photograph so many times we could sketch it from memory. The glass bowl, large and clear, sitting on the kitchen table. The chunks of pineapple, slightly browning at the edges, evidence of time's passage. The serving spoon, absurdly oversized for the task, silver and substantial. Beside it, a glass containing a tea bag, the string draped over the rim. When Patsy Ramsey was shown this photograph during her interview, her response deserves our careful attention. She didn't say, "Oh yes, I prepared that." She didn't say, "I don't remember, but I must have." She said the arrangement was wrong, odd, not how she would do things. The spoon particularly troubled her. Too large, inappropriate for a child's snack, not the choice she would make. This response reveals intimate knowledge of domestic patterns while claiming complete ignorance of how this specific arrangement came to be. Patsy knows her kitchen, knows her utensils, knows her habits well enough to identify deviation from those habits. Yet she cannot explain the deviation itself. From a psychological perspective, this creates a fascinating dynamic. If Patsy truly didn't prepare this arrangement, her response makes perfect sense. She's observing evidence of someone else's actions in her space and noting how it differs from her own patterns. But if she did prepare it, her response suggests either genuine memory disruption or strategic distancing, commenting on the strangeness of her own handiwork as though it belonged to someone else. The bowl's size matters. This isn't a small dish for a child's snack, but a substantial serving bowl, the kind used for family meals. The pineapple quantity wasn't child-sized, but generous, more than a 6-year-old would typically consume. The entire arrangement suggests abundance rather than a quick midnight snack grabbed hastily. The serving spoon creates its own questions. Both parents remarked on its inappropriate size. Kitchen drawers contain many utensils. Why select this oversized spoon unless you were in a hurry and grabbed the first one that came to hand, or unless you were a child who didn't understand the distinction between serving spoons and regular spoons? And then there's the tea glass with its dangling bag. Tea is typically an adult beverage, not a child's choice. Its presence suggests someone else was present during this snacking moment, someone who prepared themselves tea while the pineapple was being consumed. From a forensic perspective, we can reconstruct a potential scenario from these physical elements. Someone removed pineapple from the refrigerator. It wasn't fresh cut, but appeared to be leftovers from prior preparation. Someone found the bowl, located the spoon, arranged the fruit. Someone else, or perhaps the same person, prepared tea. The items were left on the table rather than cleaned up, suggesting the snacking moment ended abruptly, or the participants left expecting to return. The anthropological lens examines what this arrangement reveals about household dynamics. The casualness of leaving items out suggests comfort and familiarity. People who expected to move freely through this space without concern about parental discovery or discipline. This wasn't a child sneaking forbidden snacks, but people operating with the confidence of those who belonged in this space. Yet the combination of elements, child-appropriate food, pineapple, adult-sized serving implements, adult beverage, tea, creates a hybrid scene that suggests multiple actors or adult presence during a child's snacking. The location itself is significant. The kitchen table, not a breakfast bar or coffee table or bedroom. A table where one sits down, takes time, engages in the social ritual of eating rather than hurried consumption. This suggests a moment of relative calm and normalcy, not panicked feeding or coerced consumption. People magazine documented various aspects of the Ramsey household routines, noting that the family typically maintained formal dining patterns. Hewitt, 1997. The kitchen tables used for this late-night snack might represent children operating outside normal household structure, creating their own patterns when parental supervision wasn't present. The philosophical question emerges. What does this scene tell us about the household state during the crucial hours? If the arrangement reflects adult preparation, why the emphatic denial and odd utensil choices? If it reflects children's self-service, where were the adults who should have been supervising? If it reflects some hybrid adult presence but not full engagement, awareness but not active participation, what were the adults doing while children navigated the kitchen at midnight? Theme 2. The fingerprints that can't be explained away. We return to the most concrete evidence, the fingerprints. Not trace DNA that might transfer through secondary contact. Not fibers that could float on air currents. But fingerprints, requiring actual touch, actual contact, actual handling. Patsy's prints, Burke's prints, both on the bowl. USA Today reported the fingerprint findings as investigators confirmed them. Willing, 2000. The analysis was conducted by multiple experts using standard forensic protocols. The ridge patterns matched. The identification was certain. These prints proved 2 people in the household handled this bowl during the relevant time frame. During the relevant time frame matters because fingerprints don't have timestamps. They could theoretically have been deposited days earlier. But the bowl containing fresh pineapple found the morning of December 26th creates context that narrows the window significantly. From a forensic science perspective, fingerprints left on ceramic surfaces can persist for extended periods under the right conditions. But the combination of factors, fresh pineapple in the bowl sitting on the table Christmas morning, the pineapple in JonBenét's digestive system, creates strong circumstantial connection between the fingerprints and the immediate time frame. What troubles investigators wasn't simply that family members' prints were on household items. That would be expected and unremarkable. What troubles them is the gap between the physical evidence of handling and the complete denial of knowledge about the bowl's preparation and placement. Patsy says she didn't prepare it, doesn't remember touching it, can't explain the arrangement. Yet her prints prove her hands gripped this bowl with enough pressure and contact to leave identifiable ridge patterns. The physics is straightforward. Hands touched bowl, oils from skin transferred to surface, ridge patterns were deposited. This happened. The question is when and in what context. Burke's prints create similar questions. Neither parent suggested Burke prepared the pineapple himself. John specifically stated that Burke wouldn't get up at night to fix himself such a snack. Yet Burke's prints on the bowl prove he did handle it at some point. From a psychological standpoint, the presence of both Patsy's and Burke's prints suggests either collaborative preparation, mother and son working together, or separate handling at different times. But if Patsy and Burke prepared this together, why would both deny knowledge of it? If they handled it separately, which came first and what does the sequence tell us? The research on memory and fingerprint evidence published in Forensic Science International notes that people often have poor recall of mundane touches and contacts. Drawer and Charlton, 2006. We touch hundreds of objects daily without forming lasting memories of those contacts. But when an object becomes central to a criminal investigation, when its presence contradicts stated timelines, when the touching of it becomes crucial evidence, the failure to remember takes on different significance. Could Patsy have touched the bowl earlier in the day, unrelated to the pineapple preparation? Possible but unlikely. The bowl was found with fresh pineapple, suggesting it was specifically selected for this use rather than sitting around from previous activity. Could Burke have touched it innocently, unrelated to the snacking moment? Again possible, but the coincidence of both their prints being on the specific bowl containing the specific fruit found in JonBenét's system strains credulity. The anthropological perspective asks us to consider what fingerprint evidence represents in terms of household participation and knowledge. In a family, multiple members might handle the same objects during shared activities. The presence of both Patsy's and Burke's prints could indicate a shared moment, sitting together, eating together, participating together in this late-night snack. If this was the case, if Patsy and Burke shared this pineapple moment with JonBenét, why the absolute denial? What about this ordinary domestic scene requires such emphatic obscuring? Unless, of course, the scene wasn't ordinary, wasn't entirely innocent, or led to something that makes acknowledging it impossible. From a forensic criminology standpoint, the fingerprints shift the entire burden of explanation. The intruder theory must now account for why an external perpetrator would use the family's bowl, with the family's fingerprints already on it, to feed the victim pineapple. The staging theory must explain why someone staging a crime scene would leave their own fingerprints on evidence that would obviously be analyzed. The simplest explanation, the one that requires no elaborate scenarios or unlikely coincidences, is that family members prepared and shared this snack during the crucial hours. But simple explanations create complicated problems when those same family members emphatically deny any knowledge of the snack's preparation. We're left in the uncomfortable space between what the physical evidence proves and what the stated accounts claim. The hands touched the bowl. The bowl held the pineapple. The pineapple ended up in JonBenét's digestive system. These are facts, hard and cold and unambiguous. The explanations for these facts remain fluid, shifting, contradicted by the very certainty with which they're asserted. Theme 3. The intruder theory's impossible burden. Let us walk through what the intruder theory requires us to believe about this pineapple moment. An external perpetrator, having gained access to the sleeping household, navigates to JonBenét's bedroom. The child wakes, or perhaps was already awake, and the perpetrator convinces her to come downstairs without screaming, without waking her parents, without creating the disturbance we'd expect from a 6-year-old encountering a stranger in her bedroom at night. This perpetrator, working against the clock with a child they've just abducted, decides that before proceeding to the terrible acts that would follow, they need to feed her. Not grab her and flee, not immediately subdue her, but feed her. So they navigate to the kitchen, locate the refrigerator, find pineapple inside, select a bowl from the cabinets, choose a serving spoon from the drawers, arrange the fruit in the bowl, place it on the kitchen table, and sit with the child while she eats. During this snacking moment, the perpetrator somehow ensures that the bowl they've selected for this purpose already has Patsy's and Burke's fingerprints on it, or perhaps they're unconcerned about leaving household fingerprints because... Why? Because they know fingerprints won't matter? Because they don't understand how fingerprint evidence works? Because this is such a carefully planned crime that they'll use household items but so poorly planned that they'll leave obvious evidence? The internal contradictions multiply. If the intruder knew JonBenét well enough to convince her to come downstairs without fear, where did they gain this familiarity? If they were patient enough to sit through a snacking session, why the eventual violence that would follow? If they had access to the kitchen and knowledge of where things were kept, how does this align with the supposed forced entry through a basement window? John Ramsey, confronted with these contradictions, offered the secret Santa theory, that perhaps Bill McReynolds, who had played Santa at their Christmas party, returned to the house during the night. JonBenét knew him, trusted him, would have come downstairs willingly if he promised her a surprise gift. He could have fed her pineapple as part of gaining her cooperation. Let us sit with this theory and examine its requirements. McReynolds would need to have gained access to the house. How? Through the contested basement window? Through an unlocked door? With a key no one knew he possessed? He would need to navigate through a house he'd visited only as a party guest, locate JonBenét's bedroom in the dark, wake her without disturbing her parents sleeping nearby, convince her to come downstairs for a surprise, find his way to the kitchen, locate pineapple in the refrigerator, find a bowl and spoon, prepare the snack, sit with her while she ate, and only then proceed to the basement where the terrible events would unfold. From a forensic criminology perspective, this scenario requires so many unlikely elements occurring in sequence that it strains against basic probabilistic reasoning. Each additional requirement, the access, the navigation, the trust, the snacking delay, reduces the likelihood exponentially. Moreover, the secret Santa theory must account for why McReynolds would leave the bowl sitting on the table afterward, why he would use household items that would obviously be tested for prints, why he would take time for this domestic interlude when every minute in the house increased his risk of discovery. The anthropological lens examines how this theory draws on cultural fears about predators gaining children's trust through familiar roles. It's psychologically satisfying in a dark way. It explains the child's cooperation, accounts for the domestic comfort of the snacking moment, provides an external villain. But psychological satisfaction doesn't equal evidential support. What this theory cannot explain is the fingerprint evidence. If McReynolds prepared the pineapple, how did Patsy's and Burke's prints end up on the bowl? Did he deliberately select a bowl they'd previously handled? Did they handle it afterward during the frantic morning hours, moving items around the kitchen in ways no one remembers? The logical contortions required to make the intruder theory account for the pineapple evidence reveal the theory's fundamental weakness. It can accommodate each piece of contradictory evidence only by adding new layers of unlikely explanation, creating scenarios so complex and improbable that they collapse under their own weight. From a philosophical standpoint, we're confronting the principle of parsimony. When competing explanations exist, the simplest one requiring the fewest assumptions is typically correct. The simple explanation for the pineapple is that family members prepared and consumed it during the hours they were home. The complex explanation requires external actors, unlikely access, improbable decisions, convenient fingerprint transfers, and selective amnesia about household item handling. The question becomes, at what point does our resistance to the simple explanation, because of what it implies about who was awake, active, and present during crucial hours, overcome our rational assessment of which explanation actually fits the evidence? We've been told for nearly 3 decades that an intruder fed JonBenét pineapple. We've been asked to accept scenarios that require us to ignore basic logic, to accommodate increasing improbabilities, to explain away physical evidence that points insistently inward rather than outward. Perhaps it's time to stop contorting the evidence to fit the preferred narrative and instead allow the evidence to speak its own uncomfortable truth. The pineapple was consumed in the house by people who lived in the house, using items from the house. During hours when the people in the house were the only ones with access, opportunity, and knowledge of where things were kept. Everything else is theater designed to obscure this simple, devastating fact. 3. The psychological toll, motive, control, and projection. Theme 1. The theory that couldn't hold weight. The Boulder police eventually constructed a theory they believed explained everything. Patsy Ramsey, exhausted and perhaps at the end of her patience, struck JonBenét in a moment of rage, possibly over bedwetting, possibly over some other childhood behavior that triggered explosive frustration. The blow caused fatal head trauma. Realizing what she'd done, Patsy staged an elaborate kidnapping scene to cover the accidental death, enlisting John's help or perhaps acting alone while he slept. This theory appeared to account for multiple elements: the domestic staging using household materials, the overly elaborate ransom note that read more like a mother's imagination of criminal communication than actual criminal practice, the internal contradictions that suggested someone unfamiliar with actual kidnapping procedures, the fierce protection of family narrative above cooperation with investigation. When we examine Patsy's response to this theory, we find not simple denial but contextualized refutation that forces us to consider whether the police framework adequately captured her psychological reality. Patsy had survived stage 4 ovarian cancer, a diagnosis that carries roughly 17% 5-year survival rate. She beat odds that should have claimed her life. She described her survival as miraculous, attributed it to faith and fierce determination to remain with her children. In interviews, she spoke about how the experience transformed her perspective, made trivial frustrations seem insignificant, recalibrated what she considered worthy of stress or anger. "I fought to live to be with my children," she said, the statement carrying the weight of someone who had stared at mortality and chosen life. Could such a person, so recently returned from death's edge, so grateful for survival, so conscious of life's fragility and preciousness, explode in fatal rage over wet bed sheets? From a psychological standpoint informed by research on post-traumatic growth, Patsy's self-description aligns with documented patterns. Studies published in the Journal of Traumatic Stress show that survivors of life-threatening illness often experience permanent shifts in stress reactivity. Tedeschi and Calhoun, 2004. What once triggered frustration no longer does. perspective has been fundamentally altered by confronting existential threat. Dr. Lawrence Calhoun, who pioneered research on post-traumatic growth, describes how brush with mortality creates what he calls existential recalibration, a permanent reordering of what matters. Calhoun and Tedeschi, 2006. Survivors frequently report that minor daily frustrations simply don't register anymore. The stress response system itself changes, becoming less reactive to everyday irritants after experiencing major existential crisis. Could someone with this recalibrated stress response lose control so catastrophically over bedwetting? The psychological research suggests it would be unlikely, not impossible. Humans are capable of profound inconsistency, of acting in ways that contradict their stated values and recent experiences, but unlikely enough that we should examine whether the theory adequately accounts for Patsy's documented psychological state. Moreover, Patsy's visible relationship with JonBenét complicates the rage theory. People magazine documented the hours Patsy invested in JonBenét's pageant participation, the travel, the preparation, the coaching, the public presentations. Hewitt, 1997. Whatever we might think about child pageantry, it represented sustained time investment, attention, active engagement with this child's activities and success. This doesn't prove innocence. Parents who invest heavily in children's achievements sometimes do so for their own validation rather than the child's benefit, creating pressure that can explode into violence when the child fails to perform or cooperate. Attachment can be twisted, possessive, ultimately destructive, but the pageant involvement does suggest a parent whose identity was wrapped up in this child, whose public presentation depended on JonBenét's success, whose social standing derived partly from being mother to this beautiful, accomplished child. Would such a parent destroy the source of that validation in a moment of rage over a trivial frustration? The physiological dimension asks us to consider what would be required for fatal violence during a rage incident. The autopsy documented severe head trauma, the kind of impact requiring significant force. Could a moment of frustrated anger, even explosive anger, generate this level of force? Or does such severe injury suggest something more than a single frustrated strike? From a forensic criminology perspective, the bedwetting theory fails to account for the crime scene's sophistication. If Patsy struck JonBenét in rage, immediately realized the severity of injury and panicked, we'd expect minimal staging. Perhaps hiding the body, creating superficial signs of intruder entry, a brief note. We wouldn't expect a 3-page ransom note requiring 20+ minutes to compose. Complex garrote construction, careful body positioning, elaborate bondage staging. The theory asks us to believe that someone in acute shock and panic, having just accidentally caused their child's death, could then shift into strategic mode sophisticated enough to create multi-layered deception, working methodically over what must have been hours to construct the crime scene. The psychological transition required, from explosive rage to controlled staging, from losing control to exhibiting extraordinary control, seems to exceed what trauma psychology suggests would be possible. The anthropological lens examines how the bedwetting theory draws on cultural scripts about maternal perfectionism and the hidden rage beneath perfect surfaces. American middle-class motherhood in the 1990s demanded impossible standards. Perfect children, perfect homes, perfect public presentations. When reality failed to match these expectations, the theory suggests rage erupted. This cultural script is psychologically satisfying. It explains why a seemingly devoted mother might harm her child, why someone invested in appearance might create elaborate staging, why the perfect family might hide dark secrets. But cultural scripts, however satisfying, must still be supported by evidence. The bedwetting theory became popular not because evidence pointed definitively toward it, but because it offered psychological coherence, a motive, a trigger, an explanation for how love could transform into fatal violence. Yet when we examine it closely, testing it against Patsy's documented psychological state, the sophistication of the staging, the timeline requirements, the physiological demands of the scenario, it begins to fracture under the weight of its own assumptions. Theme 2. The divergent grief that became suspicion. In the first hours after discovering the ransom note, John and Patsy Ramsey exhibited profoundly different responses to the unfolding crisis. These differences, documented in police reports and witness statements, would become a foundation of investigative suspicion. The idea that their grief didn't look right, that their behavioral divergence suggested deception rather than individual coping differences. Patsy collapsed, literally, physically, emotionally. Officers described her as nearly catatonic with grief, lying on the floor near the front door, sobbing, unable to communicate coherently, requiring medication and constant friend support. She remained in this state for hours, present physically but psychologically unreachable, consumed by a terror and despair that rendered her non-functional. John, by contrast, moved into problem-solving mode. He made calls to his pilot about the planned Atlanta trip, to his banker about getting the ransom money, to family about the crisis. He paced, checking the time, monitoring the clock for when the supposed kidnappers would call with instructions. He maintained enough composure to speak with officers, to explain the note's discovery, to participate in the household's management. Detective Linda Arndt documented these differences in her report, and her observations became central to the investigation's direction. She noted that John seemed oddly controlled for a father whose daughter had been kidnapped. She observed him periodically leaving the main area where others gathered, disappearing for stretches of time. She documented that the couple seemed emotionally distant from each other, showing minimal interaction despite facing their worst nightmare together. Arndt later stated that when she informed John that JonBenét was dead, she saw something in his eyes that convinced her of his guilt. She couldn't articulate exactly what she saw, just a knowing, a certainty, a recognition that the reaction didn't match what a devastated father's reaction should be. From a psychological perspective, Arndt's response represents something both understandable and deeply problematic. Understandable because we all carry internal scripts about how people should respond to tragedy, and when observed behavior deviates from those scripts, alarm bells sound. Problematic because psychological research consistently demonstrates that there is no universal grief response, that people navigate trauma using wildly different coping mechanisms. That behavioral presentation tells us almost nothing reliable about guilt or innocence. Research published in Psychological Bulletin examined how people respond to acute trauma, finding enormous variation in immediate reactions. Bonanno and Kaltman, 1999. Some people dissociate, appearing calm or even inappropriately cheerful while internally experiencing overwhelming distress. Others emotionally flood, becoming non-functional with grief. Others shift into hyperactivity, seeking control through action. All these responses can be authentic trauma reactions. Dr. George Bonanno, a leading researcher in grief and trauma, describes how trauma shatters the assumptive world, our basic beliefs about safety, control, and how life works. Bonanno, 2004. Different personalities respond to this shattering differently. Some people collapse into the shattered pieces, others immediately try to reassemble them, seeking meaning and control through action. Neither response is more or less authentic than the other. John's explanation for his composure deserves our attention. He referenced his older daughter Beth's death in a car accident years earlier, describing how he felt helpless and unable to act. He stated that when JonBenét was supposedly kidnapped, he refused to surrender to that helplessness again. He would muster every ounce of capacity to think clearly, to follow the ransom note's instructions, to do whatever was necessary to get his daughter back alive. This explanation describes a conscious choice to compartmentalize emotion in service of action. a strategy some trauma survivors develop after previous experiences with loss. It doesn't prove innocence, but it provides a psychologically coherent alternative to the interpretation that composure equals guilt. The physiological dimension asks us to consider how bodies respond to acute threat. Some nervous systems activate into fight or flight hyperarousal, the body flooding with adrenaline, heart racing, mobilizing for action. Others shut down into freeze response, the body going into conservation mode, affect flattening, movement slowing. Both are authentic stress responses governed by autonomic nervous system activation patterns that individuals don't consciously control. Patsy's collapse might represent freeze response, the nervous system overwhelmed to the point of shutdown. John's problem-solving might represent fight response, the nervous system mobilizing all resources toward addressing the threat. The divergence tells us they have different autonomic response patterns, not that one is authentic and the other performance. From an anthropological perspective, we can examine how gender expectations shaped interpretation of the Ramsey's behavioral differences. In American culture of the 1990s, women were expected to be emotional, to express grief openly, to collapse under overwhelming stress. Men were expected to be strong, to maintain composure, to channel emotion into action. Patsy's response aligned perfectly with gendered expectations for maternal grief. John's response aligned perfectly with gendered expectations for paternal crisis management. Yet both were viewed suspiciously. Patsy's as potentially theatrical, John's as potentially controlled. They couldn't win because the script for how innocent parents should behave in this situation didn't actually exist. Any behavior could be read as suspicious once suspicion was activated. What troubles us about the investigative focus on behavioral presentation is how it overshadowed physical evidence. The Boulder police became convinced the Ramseys didn't act right, and this behavioral assessment drove their hypothesis more strongly than the material evidence in front of them. The DNA that didn't match the family, the ransom notes characteristics suggesting an author not necessarily familiar with the family's intimate details. The lack of definitive staging evidence proving internal perpetration. The forensic psychology literature warns repeatedly about the dangers of behavioral profiling in real-time crisis. Research in law and human behavior demonstrates that investigators' assessments of whether someone is acting guilty or acting innocent perform barely better than chance when tested against actual guilt or innocence. Vry, 2008. Yet these assessments feel compelling in the moment, creating investigative certainty where only uncertainty should exist. We find ourselves contemplating a tragic irony, that the very emotional authenticity of the Ramseys' different trauma responses became evidence against them. Patsy's collapse looked theatrical because it was so extreme. John's composure looked calculated because it seemed too controlled. The distance between them looked suspicious because people in crisis should cling together. Every authentic response to unbearable stress was misread as evidence of deception, because it didn't match the internal scripts investigators carried about how innocent people should behave. Theme 3. The investigation that chose its target. By the afternoon of December 26th, before extensive evidence analysis, before comprehensive interviews, before forensic results were even available, the Boulder police had made a decision about the direction of their investigation. They would focus on the family. Specifically, they would focus on proving that Patsy or John or both had caused JonBenét's death and staged the kidnapping to cover it. This decision wasn't entirely unreasonable. Statistically, children harmed in their homes are most often harmed by family members, and the circumstances contained elements suggesting internal rather than external perpetration. But the speed with which this hypothesis hardened into certainty and the resistance to evidence that contradicted it created investigative tunnel vision that would plague the case for decades. The Boulder Daily Camera documented the police department's approach, noting how early statements from officials emphasized the family as investigative focus. Brennan, 1997. Leaks to media, whether authorized or not, created public perception that the Ramseys were guilty before comprehensive investigation had even been completed. Detective Steve Thomas, who later wrote a book about the case, described his absolute certainty that Patsy was responsible. He stated that the evidence all pointed toward her, that the handwriting analysis suggested her authorship of the note, that her behavior during the investigation confirmed his suspicions. Yet when we examine what Thomas presents as definitive evidence, we find much that is ambiguous, interpretable multiple ways, susceptible to confirmation bias. From a forensic criminology perspective, confirmation bias represents one of the most dangerous pitfalls in criminal investigation. Once investigators decide on a theory, they unconsciously begin weighting evidence that supports the theory more heavily than evidence that contradicts it. Evidence that fits is remembered and emphasized. Evidence that doesn't is dismissed or minimized. The Boulder police exhibited classic confirmation bias. The ransom note's handwriting similarities to Patsy's became proof of her authorship despite expert analysis being inconclusive. The pineapple became evidence of family lies despite alternative explanations being available. The behavioral observations became evidence of guilt despite trauma psychology suggesting innocent explanations. The DNA evidence that didn't match any family member was dismissed as irrelevant or contamination, despite being found in highly relevant locations. Meanwhile, leads pointing toward external perpetration were under-pursued or dismissed. The HITEC boot print found in the basement not matching any family footwear was noted but not vigorously investigated. The unknown DNA was cataloged but treated as potentially irrelevant. The evidence suggesting the basement window as potential entry point was dismissed based on cobweb evidence without extensive investigation of alternative access routes. USA Today reported on the growing conflict between Boulder Police and the District Attorney's Office, with the DA expressing concern that the police had fixated on the family to the exclusion of other possibilities. Willing, 1998. This institutional split created a situation where even within the investigation, competing theories and approaches prevented coherent progress. The psychological dimension asks us to consider what happens when investigators become personally invested in a theory. The Boulder police criticized for missing evidence, for failing to secure the crime scene, for allowing the investigation to become contaminated, had strong psychological incentives to believe family guilt. If the family was responsible, then the investigative failures mattered less. Even with perfect procedure, proving family guilt in cases like this is notoriously difficult. But if an intruder was responsible, then the police failures directly enabled that person to escape justice. The psychological burden of that possibility might have made the family guilt theory psychologically necessary for investigators. From an anthropological perspective, we can examine how the conflict became a clash of resources and class. The Ramseys could afford top criminal defense attorneys, private investigators, media consultants, forensic experts. The Boulder police, a department more accustomed to property crime than homicide investigation, found themselves outmatched in resources and expertise. The investigation became in part about institutional pride and power. Police insisting on family guilt partly because backing down would mean admitting their approach had been wrong from the start. What emerged was a scenario where each side became entrenched, where cooperation became impossible, where the goal shifted from finding truth to winning the conflict. The Ramseys insisted on intruder theory and refused cooperation they viewed as hostile rather than investigative. The police insisted on family guilt and interpreted refusal to cooperate as evidence confirming their theory. The feedback loop, once activated, became self-perpetuating and impossible to break. The New York Times documented the unprecedented grand jury process, noting that the jury heard evidence for over a year before reportedly voting to indict the Ramseys on charges of child abuse resulting in death and accessory to crime. Belloc, 1999. Yet DA Alex Hunter declined to prosecute, stating the evidence was insufficient to secure conviction. This outcome tells us something crucial, that even a grand jury, hearing extensive evidence in a process that typically results in indictment, couldn't point definitively toward the straightforward murder scenario the police favored. The charges they reportedly considered child abuse resulting in death, accessory to crime, suggest they believed something occurred within the family but couldn't determine exact responsibility or sequence of events. From a legal perspective, the grand jury's reported decision and the DA's refusal to prosecute reveal the evidentiary gap at the case's heart. Strong enough to create suspicion, generate investigation, occupy grand jury time. Not strong enough to prove beyond reasonable doubt in court. Sufficient to destroy the family's reputation and peace. Insufficient to secure legal accountability or resolution. We're left contemplating a tragedy that multiplied, a child lost, an investigation that chose its target before completing its analysis, a family that became defendant before being formally accused, a public convinced of guilt that was never legally proven, a case that remains officially unsolved despite decades of certainty about who was responsible. The pineapple sits there still in photographs and testimony, a simple fruit that became the silent witness to contradictions no explanation has successfully resolved. Its presence proves that the stated timeline cannot be true, that someone's account of that night is incomplete or false, that the hours before JonBenét's death contained activities no one has fully acknowledged. Whether those activities point toward the external intruder the family insists existed, or toward internal dynamics the investigation suspected, remains unresolved not because evidence is lacking, but because the evidence itself refuses to cohere into a single narrative that accounts for all the documented facts without requiring us to ignore some to accept others. Conclusion: the silence that endures. We've walked through the pineapple evidence from every angle we can imagine. The biological fact of its consumption, the physical evidence of the bowl and fingerprints, the impossible contradictions in the stated timeline, the theories that try and fail to account for its presence, the psychological dynamics that might explain the denials, the investigative failures that prevented resolution. What remains is not certainty but a deep understanding of why certainty has eluded us for nearly 3 decades. The pineapple evidence is simultaneously concrete and interpretable, definitive and ambiguous. It proves some elements of the stated timeline are false. It doesn't prove who prepared it, who consumed it with JonBenét, or what occurred during or after that snacking moment that makes acknowledging it so impossible. Patsy Ramsey died in 2006, taking whatever she knew about the pineapple to her grave. She never wavered from her stated position. She didn't prepare it, didn't feed it, couldn't explain it. Whether this was truth her traumatized mind genuinely believed or a protective fiction maintained to the end, we cannot know. John Ramsey continues to search for the intruder he insists took his daughter's life, continues to advocate for renewed DNA testing, continues to believe that resolution will come when the unknown male DNA is identified and connected to a person. Perhaps he's right. Perhaps there are answers waiting in genetic genealogy databases, in evidence not yet tested with current technology, in connections not yet made. Or perhaps the answers have always been there, hiding in plain sight in a bowl of pineapple sitting on a kitchen table, in fingerprints that prove handling but not intent, in a digestive timeline that contradicts stated certainties, in the gap between what was said and what the physical evidence whispers. The New York Times recently revisited the case, noting that even with advancing technology and renewed investigative interest, the fundamental questions remain unanswered. Kolker, 2016. The pineapple continues to haunt the timeline, continues to resist integration into any neat explanation, continues to suggest that someone knows more than they've said about those final hours. We stand where we've always stood, knowing the child ate pineapple, knowing family members handled the bowl, knowing the stated timeline cannot account for these facts, uncertain what the gap between timeline and evidence actually reveals. We've examined possibilities ranging from innocent memory failures to calculated deception, from external perpetrators gaining impossible access to internal dynamics too painful to acknowledge. What we can say with certainty is limited. The pineapple was consumed after the family arrived home. Someone prepared or served it. Someone's fingerprints are on the bowl. Someone's account of that evening is incomplete. These are facts established by biology, forensics, and physics, sciences that don't lie to protect narratives or serve psychological needs. The explanations for these facts remain contested, shifting, impossible to verify or definitively disprove. We're left in the space between knowing something occurred and understanding what that something means, between physical evidence and psychological truth, between documented contradictions and satisfying resolution. The pineapple keeps its secret still. Not because it cannot speak, but because we've learned to stop listening when what it says contradicts the narratives we've chosen to believe. Perhaps one day the silence will break, the contradictions will resolve, the gap between evidence and explanation will close. Until then, the fruit sits there in the photographic record, ordinary and terrible, a witness to events that nearly 30 years of investigation hasn't successfully reconstructed. We search for truth in the fragments, knowing that certainty may forever exceed our grasp, scattered across contradictions too numerous to ignore and explanations too numerous to satisfy. The pineapple remains silent, accusatory, unresolved. The one witness that cannot be made to change its story, cannot be convinced to align with preferred narratives, cannot be silenced by denials, however emphatic or sustained.